Thank
Yes,
you.
I did say, sorry to stop you, but 1 second. If anyone, sorry, I did forget one announcement, and that is that we're going to record the event tonight. So basically, if you don't want to be on camera, please turn your cameras off and go on mute if you don't want to be captured. Thank you. Sorry, Roman, to
That's all right.
Cool.
That's all right. Well, thank you for the warm welcome. Lovely to be with you. So I have a few slides prepared that I'd like to share with you. So I'll try to do that. This looks interesting. So hopefully you can see a title slide that says Agile Product Roadmaps. It's probably not overly exciting. But that's the topic that I've suggested for tonight. So how can we work with product roadmaps, with product plans effectively in an Agile context? That's what I'd like to explore with you. And so there's a slide deck that I'd like to share with you. It'll take me about 30 minutes or so to share my thoughts, my views with you. And then I'm very much looking forward to your questions. So my suggestion is I'll do the talk and then we'll do the Q&A. There are 4 things that I thought might be worthwhile to cover. So first of all, talk a little bit about what is a product roadmap to make sure we have a shared understanding. And then talk about a specific roadmap format that I found especially helpful in an Agile setting, goal-oriented or outcome-based roadmaps. Then explore how the roadmap relates to other key artifacts, the product backlog, but also an overarching higher level product strategy. And then finally, talk a little bit about collaborating on roadmaps and inspecting and adapting, reviewing roadmaps. So that's the plan. Right. Yes, introduction. So I don't know how this is for you, but certainly for me, this is the time of year where, as the days are getting shorter and shorter and the weather's turning bad. I mean, at the moment here in Buckinghamshire in the UK, it's raining and it's getting chilly. I think about a summer holiday and I start thinking about, well, where could we go? And wouldn't it be nice maybe to go somewhere warm, hang out at the beach and chill and recharge batteries, spend some quality time with the family. And assuming that travel restrictions will be eased and everything will become easier again in terms of traveling abroad, maybe one of those places could be somewhere in the south of France. I haven't been to France now for a few years. And I think there's a place called Argelès-sur-Mer. So you can see that here on this Google map screenshot. It's pretty close to the border, I think Spain, Andorra. But if you're like me and you get bored after hanging out at the beach for a few days and you want to get active again, then you can head to the backcountry, to the hills and do some walking or running or possibly cycling. Now, as you can see, I live in Wendover, near London. And so if my family and I decide that we'd like to go to Argelès-sur-Mer and that we're going to drive there, so it's going to be a road trip, then I would naturally use a mapping tool, Google Maps, Apple Maps, or possibly even try to find a paper-based map somewhere in our house and figure out what are the options, what are the route choices. And the first decision we'd have to make is, how do we get from the UK to France? How do we cross the channel? Should we take the shuttle, the train, or should we take the ferry? And then should we drive via Paris or Lyon? And you can see it's a pretty long journey. It's over 14 hours driving time. Should we maybe break it up? Should we pre-plan some stops? Should we possibly consider staying overnight and book a hotel? So, for me, that's something that comes quite natural. I mean, I've learned from experience not to blindly trust the sat nav, certainly not when the kids are in the back of the car, but to do a little bit of pre-planning and sort of kind of anticipate how the journey might unfold. Things might change. There might be a traffic jam somewhere, or we might, there might be, I don't know, we might then another hold up or something. But at least I'm sort of aware of the different choices I have, or we have, in terms of traveling to southern France. And I would suggest that you do something similar for your products. So a product roadmap very much allows you to do this. For me, it's a plan, and it should be an actionable plan, a plan that can be put into practice, that anticipates the journey you want to take your product on, and that shows how the product is likely to evolve over the coming months. And so typical time frame I like to suggest for roadmaps for digital products is somewhere between 6, 9, and 12 months. And then a product roadmap typically covers several major releases or product versions. Think of, I don't know, Windows. Where are we with Windows? Is it 11 these days, or iOS? Is it 15? Or I get lost. So a major release would be a release that adds some usually noticeable value to the users and or customers. And so yes, our product roadmap typically covers some of those. And then finally, there are different types of product roadmaps, as you're probably aware of anyway, including, say, technology roadmaps and visionary roadmaps. But I'd really like to focus on product roadmaps. And product roadmaps come at least in 2 flavors, internal roadmaps and external or public roadmaps. And the ones I'd like to talk about are internal roadmaps, where the target audience are the development teams, the stakeholders, and maybe a sponsor, and not necessarily users and customers, so private internal roadmaps. So I've said it might be a good idea to anticipate the journey you want to take your product on by using a product roadmap. Why? Why is that so useful? Well, a product roadmap has or can provide at least a number of benefits. So it can offer a continuity of purpose, and that can be particularly helpful in an agile environment where, if you use a framework like Scrum, you might, or the development teams might kind of otherwise look from sprint to sprint to sprint. Or just maybe look at the next 2 to 3 months. And so looking at a longer time frame, say 9 to 12 months, it gives you that continuity of purpose, can make it easier to make the right design, architecture, and technology decisions. And then it helps to, in a way, integrate and align the stakeholders and development team or teams and make sure that people move towards ultimately shared goals or outcomes, and create value together. So, in a way, you could say a product roadmap can facilitate moving together in the right direction. So for me, a product roadmap is a strategic plan, and hopefully a shared strategic plan. It communicates, talking about strategy, how the product strategy will be implemented, and I'll say more about how this can be done in a little while. And it can also then direct and unburden the product backlog, something that I found very handy. And again, I'll say a little bit more about this later. And finally, if you're in the position that you have to acquire a budget for a development effort or for your product, then again, this is where the product roadmap can be useful. However, sometimes I get asked if product roadmaps aren't bad, if they aren't anti-agile. And so for me, a product roadmap per se is neither bad nor anti-agile, but I do think the product road mapping approach that we choose does matter. So traditionally, the traditional way to build product roadmaps is essentially to identify a list of features and then map those features onto a timeline. So what you end up with is, a product roadmap like this. It's a really nice visualization of essentially how features, capabilities are created or enhanced over a period of time. So we have a feature like single sign-on here, for instance, or Facebook integration, or we have a feature like Apple Pay. But what we don't understand here, what isn't clearly communicated, is why it is worthwhile to provide or enhance a single sign-on, for instance. What is the value for the users, maybe for some customers and for the business? Why should we do this? The other thing with a feature-based roadmap that I found difficult is that it can lead to solutionizing. We anticipate what the product should look like and do a fair amount in advance without necessarily having the right information to do this. And that can take away creativity and the freedom to experiment and make the right decisions from the development teams, or at least it can constrain them, overly constrain them. Yeah. So, these are a few reasons why I think you'd like to avoid feature-based roadmaps. So certainly in an agile environment where we assume there is a significant amount of change, there is uncertainty, and there's maybe an element of innovation. Yeah. But however, if you Google or you perform an internet search and well, you look for a product roadmap, then still most roadmap pictures that you get are essentially feature-based roadmaps. So my experience suggests those type of roadmaps are still pretty dominant. Now, if feature-based roadmaps are common in the traditional way to design, build a product roadmap, but not helpful necessarily in an agile context, what could help us? Well, my answer is goal-oriented roadmaps. Now, some people prefer the term outcome-based. Some people like to talk about benefits-based or themed roadmaps, or more recently, I've also encountered the term problem-based roadmaps. I mean, for me, those terms are largely synonymous. They're largely interchangeable. They essentially mean that we no longer first and foremost focus on features, but we really like to focus on benefits. We really like to focus on the value that we want to create with our product rather than the what, the capabilities. So I thought I'll share a specific roadmap template with you, just one way how you can create a goal-oriented outcome-based roadmap. This is a template I created a few years back. And so you can see it contains of 5 sections, or it has 5 elements, and the one in the middle is the central one and the most important one. That's the goal, or the product goal. And here the idea is to describe the outcome, the specific outcome that the product should provide, that should be achieved, or the specific benefit that should be offered. And essentially the idea is to answer the question, why is the product being developed? Why is it worthwhile to spend time, energy, and money on progressing this product? What is the benefit? And I usually start with the goals first. I usually start by determining goals and then ordering those goals so that a meaningful narrative is created. And I'll share a sample goal-oriented roadmap based on this template with you shortly. I just thought I'll introduce, well, the structure, the template first to you. So a goal is really the most important element of a goal-oriented outcome-based roadmap. But you can see I also like to consider dates or timeframes. Now, dates on a product roadmap have been a very controversial topic in the product management community for a number of years. Some people feel very uneasy about putting down dates or timeframes, but remember, this is an internal product roadmap, so it's not meant to be communicated to users and customers, but it's really used by the person in charge of the product, the development team or teams, and the stakeholders. And I find that often it's very useful to not only understand what are the outcomes, the benefits, the goals that we'd like to achieve or meet, but also do we have any time constraints, or how long is it likely to take us to achieve a certain benefit, to make it happen? And therefore, is it realistic? And I think that is useful because I would suggest that your product roadmap should be a realistic, actionable plan. Often there's a trade-off decision then that we have to make and say, what is more important, that we stick to a specific date or time frame, or that we fully meet a goal. What else do we have on here? Metrics. So the idea to include metrics on a product roadmap is to be able to understand if a goal has been met and a desired outcome has been achieved. And at the same time, to encourage people to choose specific and, if possible, measurable goals. So I think it's great to work with a vision as a big, lofty, inspirational goal. But I think when we talk about goals, when we talk about product goals on a roadmap, they have to be much more focused. And so a good time frame for goals that I like to suggest is on a roadmap around about 3 months as a rule of thumb. So somewhere between 6 weeks and maybe 4 months max, and 2 to 3 months, as I said, is sort of a good common time frame. And then you can see I still include features on my goal-oriented roadmaps. However, those features have to support existing goals. So features are there to describe desired or necessary outputs, results, or deliverables. And every feature must help meet a goal. And so, if a stakeholder comes to you and says, must provide this, I don't know, enhanced reporting feature, I'm making this up, and we must do it immediately, we must put it on the roadmap, then, I'd say, look, if there's a goal that supports this feature. If there is not such a goal, you've got 2 choices. You can decline the feature request, or you can change the product roadmap and introduce a new goal. But obviously, that'd be then a bigger change. And then I like to ensure that features are really big, huge capabilities. So no epics, no user stories on roadmaps. It should really be a high-level strategic plan, not a hidden product backlog or not overlap with the product backlog. And finally, I like to limit the number of features per goal to 3 to 5 with a preference for the smaller number. Yeah, so that was my features caveat. Yeah, and then if meeting the goal does result in a major release, a new product version, then you can give it a name if you wish to. I think Android went through a period where the operating system releases received some really cool names. Wasn't there one that was called Marshmallow? So yeah. Yes. Anyway, I thought that was a nice idea to use some unusual names for releases. So how can this be applied, this template? Well, here is a sample roadmap. The idea is, I should have said that before I showed the first goal. The idea is to offer a healthy eating product. So the vision is to help people eat more healthily. Healthy eating product, it's an example I like to use because I hope that you can relate to it. And so I'm trying to build here a brand new product. And so the goal of the MVP, the very first version, might be to help the users understand their eating habits, or maybe some of their eating habits, and at the same time acquire an initial user base. And so I have developed a preference to use compound goals on product roadmaps, compound product goals with a user and a business facing part, because I feel that ultimately a product is a value creating vehicle, an asset that creates value for a group of people, users, possibly customers in the business. So I like to kind of express those two sides of the those two different types of values in my goals, in my product roadmap and product goals. Yeah, but you don't necessarily have to do it that way. I used to only focus on the business value, but as I said, after receiving feedback, talking to people, thinking about it, I thought like it's actually a nice idea to use those compound goals. The next goal might be then to help the users improve their eating habits and extends the user base, and then help the users get fitter and start generating revenue through in-app purchases, and then help the users meet their personal fitness targets and retain users. So you can see that these goals build on each other. And as I said earlier, they create a story or a narrative. And so thereby describe the journey that you want to take your product on, anticipate how the product might grow based on what we know right now. And so I've added some dates here. So quarterly releases, and or at least meeting those goals on a quarterly basis. That's what it says here. And then it seems that, yes, I'm planning to have some major releases on new product versions. And there are also some features here. But you can see I've only added 2 features per goal, and these features are big. So a healthy eating dashboard, for instance, when you look at the goal of the MVP, it doesn't really tell us what information will be kept on this dashboard. Similarly, integration with smartwatches and fitness devices doesn't really say how this will be done, nor which specific smartwatches and fitness devices will offer integration with. And so I'm being intentionally sketchy here, again, not to solutionize and not to overly constrain the creativity of the development team. But at the same time, I found that it can be useful to add those big high-level features to provide a little bit more guidance and direction, both to development teams and stakeholders. And then finally, I've added some metrics here, or largely placeholders for metrics. So the first one might be good enough, be in the top 15 diabetes apps 6 weeks after launch. But then the other ones, say of the second goal, activations, engagement, and NPS, they need to be made more specific. And I think it'd be desirable to state some targets here. So how many activations would we like to see within a certain period of time? And how are we going to measure engagement, and what's our expectation around engagement or net promoter score? But for me, that roadmap probably would be good enough to now make a go or no-go decision, and then start stocking an initial product backlog and work towards the MVP. So that's one way how you can work with goals or outcomes and put them on a roadmap. Now, if that's what you want to do, then what about the context in which a product roadmap kind of exists? The first element here I'd like to explore is the product strategy and the product roadmap. So here's our roadmap, and roadmap answers the questions: what are the specific outcomes product will create over the next 12 months or so, and the number of pieces of information that it contains. At least that's what I suggested earlier. Now, I also suggested what we'd like to achieve is an actionable, a realistic, or a feasible product roadmap. Now, if that's the case, then how can we ensure that our product roadmap is indeed actionable? And how can we make sure that it does contain the right product goals? How can we tell? Well, my answer to this is by complementing a product roadmap with a product strategy, or maybe to put it differently, not by starting with a product roadmap, but actually first of all, capturing a product strategy. So what do I mean by product strategy? For me, product strategy describes the approach that we choose to realize the vision, our overarching vision, so like healthy eating, for instance, and make the product successful. And so the 4 elements that I like to include in a vision. The first one are the needs, or the main needs, the main problem, the main benefit that the product should offer. That might be, for instance, to stay with the healthy eating example, to reduce the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. The market, the target group, well, that might be middle-aged men like myself. I might want to make that a little bit more specific, but it's good enough as an example for now. Some standout features: personalized eating recommendations, because we will be using advanced machine learning technologies. Super easy integration with smartwatches and devices, and I'll think of a third one, but hopefully again it's good enough as an example. And the business goals might be to open up a new revenue source, possibly to diversify the business, or maybe to develop the brand, enhance the brand. And so for me, that's something I'd like to think about first, and I'd like to write down my thoughts, but that's not quite enough. I'd also like to then validate the strategy and make sure that what I've written down, those statements, are likely to be correct. So I'll assess these statements for assumptions and risks. And then I might carry out, for instance, some direct observation or some user customer interviews. Maybe some prototyping is necessary in order to explore some of the technical risks. Maybe I need to engage in some business modeling activities to see if the business goals are achievable, if they are realistic. And once I've done this, once I've essentially done just enough, just in time, you could say, market and user research, and maybe possibly even a little bit of technology exploration research, once I've got a validated strategy, then I would ask myself, what would be a first good step? So what would be first good steps in order to meet the needs, which are essentially the user and customer goals and the business goals. And so the needs and business goals would then would direct my effort to discover the right product roadmap content, discover the right goals on my product roadmap. So those direct the roadmap, as I said, and they help determine the right product goals. So here, my recommendation is base your product roadmap on a product strategy, and that product strategy should have been validated. So it should be a valid or a validated product strategy. So your product roadmap is not built on sand, but it's hopefully built on empirical evidence, on some data that you've collected. And it really then helps you express how you intend to implement the strategy over, say, the next 12 months or so. And in that sense, then the product roadmap details the product strategy and it complements the product strategy. Now, talking about product roadmap and product strategy, well, what about then the product backlog and the product roadmap? Product backlog is another important planning artifact in an agile context for product people. So again, here's our product roadmap. Hooray, hooray, hooray. Now, here is our product backlog. And traditionally, I'd say the product backlog answers the questions: which functionality and maybe which UX design should the product offer. We've got things in here like epics, user stories, possibly workflow diagrams and journeys, sketches, mockups, and non-functional requirements. So we have now a product roadmap, we have a product backlog. How do the two things hang together, and how do we get from the product roadmap to the backlog? Do we get from the backlog to the roadmap? How does that work? Well, for me, it's I'd like to start with the product roadmap. with my actionable product roadmap, and then select the upcoming goal on that product roadmap, the product goal, and essentially literally copy that into the product backlog. So those of you who are keep up with the developments in the Scrum space might have noticed that the latest version of the Scrum Guide, which was published about a year ago, introduced product goals, something that I thought was great. I like product goals. I mean, I just kind of gave you examples for product goals a few minutes ago, and how you sort of talked about how you can include them on a product roadmap. I've been working with them for years. So, if you in the Scrum Guide now suggests that the product backlog uses a product goal and is focused by this product goal, directed by it, and that you only include items in the product backlog that are necessary in order to reach this product goal, which generally speaking, again, I support. I think that's the right recommendation. I've seen in the past, I don't know, 15 to 20 years, so many product backlogs that were way too big that really suffered from the fact that there wasn't a clear outcome, there wasn't a clear benefit, there wasn't a clear goal that somehow held together all the items in the product backlog, but they were more or less wish lists. There was no focus. So I think it can be really useful to work with goals in a product backlog context and work with one specific product goal. And again, if you've kind of followed the advice I shared earlier, then you already have identified your product goals on your product roadmap. So you take the next product goal, as I mentioned, you copy it into the product backlog. You also have some high-level features. You can use them as well in order to then determine the right product backlog items and make the right tactical product decisions in the context of the product backlog. So product strategy guides and directs the product roadmap guides and directs the product backlog. But of course, if the product backlog changes significantly, that may then mean that we have to adapt the product roadmap. And if the product roadmap changes, then that might need a change, or might lead to a change, modification of the product strategy. So if you set things up the way I described it, then your artifacts, your planning artifacts, your plans will be connected, and you have to keep them in sync. Yes, actionable and focused. And that brings me on, that sort of leads me to the final topic that I'd wanted to touch upon. Oh, I've already spoken, nearly half an hour. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. So here we go. The best product roadmap is pretty much useless if it's the product owner's product roadmap or the roadmap of the person in charge of the product. And it might be beautifully crafted, well thought out, but if the development team members and stakeholders don't support it, don't understand it, then it's pretty much useless. So in an Agile Scrum-based context, we have here the person in charge of the product owner, we have the development team members, and they're most recently referred to as developers in a Scrum context, but anyway, and key stakeholders. So key stakeholders will be individuals who have an influence on the product and are needed also to progress the product and provide it. So for commercial revenue generating product, that might be somebody from marketing, sales, maybe support and finance. So those individuals I refer to as key stakeholders. And so my suggestion is to include these individuals in the road mapping activities, in creating an initial roadmap, but then also in reviewing and updating a roadmap, thereby leveraging the perspectives of the individuals, learning about their ideas, but maybe also about their concerns. Making sure that there's a shared understanding, that particularly there's a shared understanding of the goals, and maybe most importantly that people support the goals and support the product roadmap, and it's a plan that people are happy to put into action and not just pay lip service to and then go away and kind of follow their own goals. And I found that when you invite people to contribute to a decision, people are more likely to support it, even if their specific ideas and suggestions aren't necessarily taken on board. But of course, it can be challenging to make decisions together and do road mapping together, particularly if people are trapped in hierarchical thinking, if you have stakeholders who regard themselves as being more senior and as the ones who should be making the decisions. And so I think what you don't want is you don't want that the highest paid person's opinion wins. That there are one or two stakeholders who essentially make then all the decisions, and you also want to avoid that design by committee happens and you end up looking for the smallest common denominator, and your roadmap is just a very weak compromise. But you really want to make decisions that move your product forward in the right direction and attract as much support as possible. Hence, I found it can be very useful to have a Scrum Master, Agile coach present who facilitates the session and helps with the collaborative decision making, particularly if people maybe haven't worked together before much or aren't used to making decisions as a group. I think then that's particularly helpful, and that allows the person in charge of the product to actively contribute to the product decisions and not having to facilitate at the same time, which can be very challenging. Yeah. So here the message is product road mapping is best done in a collaborative fashion, certainly in an agile context where we do value collaboration, I believe. And then finally, a roadmap is just a plan based on what we know. And as it happens, plans go out of date, sometimes faster, sometimes not quite as fast. So it's worthwhile to inspect a product roadmap on a regular basis and update it. So for me, inspect and adapt is not only something that happens on in a way more tactical level, the product backlog and product increments, but also on a more strategic level, regarding the product roadmap and the product strategy. So there are two dimensions you can use to right-size the frequency. How often should you look at your roadmap and change it, update it? And that is how changeable, dynamic is the market, and how stable or changeable is your product, volatile is your product. So if the market changes significantly and so does the product, then it may make sense to review and maybe update the roadmap on a monthly basis. Otherwise, usually you can live with quarterly updates, and that's sort of the rule of thumb that I like to suggest. If you're not sure, then use quarterly strategy reviews and roadmap reviews and update those plans on a quarterly basis. If you're in a stable market, where maybe there are a few established players and there's some market entry barriers, so it's unlikely that any new market entrants will cause any disturbances, and your product is pretty stable, maybe pretty mature, then maybe you can even get away with reviewing the roadmap every 6 months. But again, if you're in doubt, start with quarterly reviews. If that's not frequent enough, then reduce the cadence and have them more frequently, and otherwise, obviously, increase it. So I hope that was a little bit useful. I'm very much looking forward to your questions now. But thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening. You can find more information on product roadmaps on my website and also in my book Strategize, which covers product roadmaps and strategy. And if you're interested in particularly the collaborative decision-making piece that I mentioned, you might also find it helpful to look at my latest book, How to Lead in Product Management. And if for whatever reason your question doesn't get answered, then don't be shy and please reach out to me and drop me an email. So thank you again. And yes, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. Yes. So
Yes, cool.
thank you. We've got John with his hand up. So let's go to John. John, can you come up, turn your mic on? Please feel free.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can, John.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot, Roman. Really clear and good presentation there. I know we spoke about internal roadmaps, but can you just quickly explain to me what the difference is between an internal and external roadmap?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you for the feedback and thank you for the question. So yes, I didn't really explain what I mean by a public or an external roadmap. So a public or external product roadmap is a roadmap that a company might decide to publish on its website, and so it's accessible to customers and maybe users. And sometimes external public product roadmaps are to a certain extent used as a marketing and sales tool to instill some confidence in the marketplace that a business is committed to a specific product and has some great ideas in the pipeline how to progress it. Some companies also just want to be transparent and say, like, why should we use two roadmaps, an external roadmap and an internal roadmap? Let's just have one, and yeah, let's share it. What do we have to hide? But of course, if you put some firm dates on an external public roadmap, then that can create some expectations, and customers might be disappointed if you then can't meet the original plan. So, the point I was trying to make is to say, working with plans in an agile environment where we have change and uncertainty is always going to be tricky, because probably sooner rather than later those plans will go out of date, and that's often hard enough to communicate internally. And get the stakeholders to understand, and usually it's even harder than to get the customers to understand this. So if you'd like to work with a roadmap that is externally visible, then my suggestion would be to omit dates, or follow Jana Basto's example and use a very vague timeframes like now, next, later, for instance. You still have some timeframes, but they're so big that really, you're not committed to a specific, say, quarter or month. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So we have a question on the chat from Matt Doherty, and he says, a lot of senior positions in an organization find a Gantt-style feature roadmap very comforting, even if it isn't delivering the value they think it is. What would your advice be to help transition senior stakeholders, organization and organizational culture to a product roadmap?
That's another great question, and it's a tricky one. Can I please have easy questions tonight? So it's a tricky one, because I think in order to find a satisfying answer, I'd have to learn a little bit more about the organizational context. So sometimes a reason why people are comfortable with feature-based roadmaps is because there's a lack of product orientation in a company, and a lack of product awareness. So not every organization thinks in terms of products. There's still organizations out there where project thinking is very widespread or dominant, and you start a project and you finish a project, and that project delivers a set of features. Why wouldn't we want to use feature-based roadmaps? Another reason is that that's what senior stakeholders are simply used to. When they were younger and maybe working on products, that's what they were using. And it's like, well, it worked 10 years ago, it worked 15 years ago, it's 20 years ago. Why wouldn't it work today? And then sometimes stakeholders also like to think about specific pieces of output, deliverables, and results. It can make, and it's true also for development team members. It's also true for product people. I've met a lot of product owners who seem to be very attached to thinking about functionality and features and epics, and kind of found it quite hard to step away from that and say, like, well, let me maybe really focus more on the why, on the desired benefits. So it can feel comfortable, it can feel more tangible than thinking about these outcomes or goals. So I think ultimately I'd have to ask you to explore for yourself, what are the drivers, what are the causes, and then figure out what can you do about it. Sometimes just trying it out makes a big difference, and saying, like, let's try this. Maybe even just go ahead and suggest it, or can I show up in a meeting with a goal-oriented roadmap template, or build one yourself, design one yourself, that works for you, and try it out and show to the stakeholders how this can be done. And who knows, they might really like it.
Cool. Thank you, Roman. Hopefully that answers your question, Matt. Mustafa, you have your hand up. Please feel free to ask your question.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation, Roman. That was very insightful. Thank you so much for your time. I just want you to really help me with this. I'm trying to get my head around, when you had the product roadmap and the example you use of 12 months, the first thing that came to my mind is waterfall. And that doesn't You know what I mean? So you're looking at like 12-month lifespan. I'm thinking, okay, if it's agile, you want it to be either quarterly rather than being like 12 months kind of, and considering budgets as well. And then the other one to attach to it on your sample of the roadmap where you had a target. You said earlier on that you should try and do it with epics, but then those on the target, those what is you had on the targets come across to me like epics.
Okay.
On the sample sheet where you had the sample roadmap.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you for your feedback and your thoughts. So for me, a longer term plan isn't necessarily anti-agile, and using agile, following agile values, principles doesn't mean that we can't have a longer term plan. So, you know, that's what I said earlier when I talked about feature-based roadmaps. You know, it very much depends on how we approach the plan. You know, how, you know, the planning approach that we choose, the road mapping approach that we choose. So I'm personally very happy with a 12-month plan if it is high level enough, so that it provides sufficient guidance, but gives enough freedom to the development teams to do and inspect and adapt on a weekly or a fortnightly basis, you know, assuming Scrum is used. You know, and if you use a Kanban-based process, that there is enough flexibility for the development team or teams to take full ownership of their Kanban boards. But I do think that it can be very useful to look beyond a quarter, and you know, it'd be interesting and maybe a longer conversation to understand why you think that in an agile context planning should be limited to a quarter. It sort of reminds me a little bit of, I think, one of the XP practices, and that might be in the, I'd have to look this up, but I believe that in the first XP book that came back, I believe published in 2001, there's a practice called quarterly releases. And so the idea was then to say at least once a quarter you must release, which is something that always resonated with me. So you go no longer then. But as I said, I think if you choose the level of granularity correctly, and if you work with outcomes, goals, benefits, I think you can happily have a longer term plan, a 12-month plan in an agile context, assuming that you regularly update it, you regularly review it and update it. I mean, you know, your product backlog might cover 12 months. In fact, until, you know, November last year, when the latest Scrum guide came out, in theory, your product backlog could have looked forward to the next 20 years. And some backlogs I've seen did that. Not something I would suggest, though.
Sorry, just in addition to that, Roman, thank you for that feedback. But I get the gist you're giving, but I'm looking at, okay, considering the market force, like anything could change anytime. So when you have a 12-month plan and things does take changes, so what do you now do then? Yeah,
that's a very good point, and that's why you essentially. So, you know, you need to establish, I sort of only very briefly alluded to it earlier, you need to establish an inspect and adapt cycle on a strategic level. So at least once a quarter, you need to review your product strategy and your product roadmap. I mean, that's something I've described in my book, Strategize, and in a number of articles. And, you know, there are a number of factors that will help you with this, including the KPIs that you use to measure how well the product is doing, the product performance, analysis of market trends, including regulatory trends, technology trends, consumer trends, the competition, any competitive moves, and any changes within your business. You also look at probably the team's ability to make progress and meet goals, any budget constraints that may have changed. And you use those pieces of information to assess if the plans are still valid, right? It's sort of, you know, maybe, as I said, you know, a separate conversation to dive a little bit deeper, but maybe you want to take a look at my website and check out some of my articles around product strategy and vision. I wrote an article about establishing the right product strategy process that might be helpful for you.
So we've got let's go to a question from chat. So we've got a hard stop at 8 o'clock. So I reckon maybe we can fit one, maybe two more questions in there. So next we have a question from Kim, which is it possible to have more than one product goal oriented roadmap in a business? And how should it be delivered if there are Scrum teams where there are disparate items being worked on in a sprint?
Okay, cool. Yes. Yeah, thank you for the question. So the simple answer is yes. I mean, you know, the way I like to set things up is, you know, first of all, identify what a product is. And then every product has its own product roadmap. And generally speaking, every product has its own product roadmap, just like every product has its own product backlog. And quite often, at least more often than not, every product also has its own product strategy. So yeah, if you have 10 products within a business, then, you know, I'd expect up to 10 roadmaps. So if teams work on different, I don't know, work items, then, you know, I would suggest you consider, you ask yourself if that's helpful. I mean, if it is, that's great. But you know, I mentioned products, and you know, a product roadmap covers one product. I also think it can be very useful to organize around products, and so that, you know, a team works on a product, or at least on a small number of products, and particularly at a given point in time. So if you use Scrum, then you know, only on one product in a sprint, ideally, maybe even only on one product for, say, a month or even 2 months. You know, so there's not too much task switching, and therefore not too much waste in the process. But yeah, maybe something to reflect on.
Yeah, thank you, Raymond. Let's maybe have one more. Darren, you've had your hand up for a little while. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Anil. Yeah, really great, Roman. Thank you again. Echo what everybody else said about this really good session. Just wanted to ask if you've had any, you know, what's your experience when you're running this kind of activity? Because what I noticed on that product roadmap is there's no kind of indication of cost. Now, whenever I talk to product management about a piece of feature or functional or some goal that we want to achieve, some outcome for the customer, there's always the next question is always, well, you know, we need to find out how much that costs in order to prioritize that against something else. So I'm just interested to see how you overcome those kind of questions. Yeah,
no, that's a very valid. It's a great question, Darren. Thank you for asking it. So I mean, ultimately, yes. So cost is certainly something we want to consider or be able to roughly estimate, at least. And so there are two ways to do this. The traditional way is to think about all the items that need to be implemented, all the requirements, and break them down. And then, you know, once we've got all the tasks, get all the tasks estimated, and once we know who carries out which task, and assuming that labor is the decisive cost factor, then we have well, a cost, you know, cost for a product, or we can cost the product roadmap, put a number, a figure, a cost figure on the product roadmap. Now that of course assumes that we're able to identify fairly detailed pieces of functionality correctly up front, and again assuming that when in a context where there's a significant amount of change and uncertainty, then that assumption doesn't hold true. So my preference simply is to use past experience in order to come up with an initial cost target. So if you don't have a development team because you're building a brand new product, then, you know, still, you know, I'd involve members of the development organization in building that roadmap, and I'd ask the members of the development organization how long they believe it would take, or how many people and with which skills are required to then, you know, implement this roadmap, say, over the next 12 months. And that should give you then an indication of the cost. Or if you have a development team, you know, obviously I'd expect that the development team or some team members are involved in creating the product roadmap and are able to say, you know, these goals look realistic, or like they're way too ambitious. You know, we'd need an additional UX designer, we need an additional tester, we need an additional, I don't know what, Java developer in order to make this happen. But I personally wouldn't go down to the level and try, you know, when we talk about product roadmaps, costs individual items in terms of features. I mean, you can try and work with a budget or allocate a budget for the goals. That might make sense. But my assumption that I operate on is that we organize around products, and we have largely more or less stable teams. And so, you know, we have one or more teams, maybe 3 teams in some cases, maybe more, who work on a product for an extended period of time, say for 12 months. And so, those are the people. And together with these people, we try and create as much value as possible, rather than asking ourselves, on this roadmap, how much does this feature cost and how much is this feature worth? I think whenever your product is young or whenever your product changes significantly, that is a question that is very hard to answer.
Yeah.
It becomes a different situation when your product is mature, when you have a very mature or stable product. Then often a cost benefit analysis on a feature basis is feasible and it does make sense. But then, often your product road mapping approach changes a little bit and your product roadmaps can become a little bit more detailed, and that is okay. But, I'd still be, how should I put this? I'd still personally would like to try and encourage people to focus on those goals. And certainly in a roadmap context, not to get hung up about the features, not to worry too much about the features.
Yeah, because if I could come back on that, is that right, Anil? So it's interesting what you say, because I think, the danger is, what I really love about this approach is the ability to flex within it, right? So its goal is outcome based. So within that outcome, and we're trying not to prescribe too much stuff in there, so that there is, we can change within that, right? We can de-scope some of the stuff, we could do whatever. So that's really valuable, I think, in what we do, how we do our work. The danger, of course, when someone says how much does it cost, then everyone has to start to, or think they need to start to break things down to understand that cost. Now it starts to become more prescribed, because now we're analyzing, breaking stuff down, and that's where that can break down this process, I think. So it's really important to keep a certain level. I mean, occurs to me, there's things like relative estimation at the higher levels, right? If you're talking about a goal, if you say that we've done this sort of product before, or this part of this product before, this sort of goal, you could always use as you said, use existing data, which I'm a big fan of, saying, okay, well, we did this sort of thing before, it's similarly sized to that. So, and that took us 6 to 9 months. So this will be 6 to 9 months of 3 teams, that equals this cost. And that's probably all you need, really, I think.
That's right. Yes, exactly. That's exactly the approach I was trying to describe. Yeah. Thank you for putting it so nicely. Absolutely. Yeah. Usually I think that's enough. And again, if as long as a product is young, as long as there's a significant amount of change or innovation, I think it's not a useful question to ask how much value does a specific piece of functionality generate, and how much does it cost? Because the first part, or the first question, is often impossible to answer, if we're being honest. And people don't buy products because of a specific piece of functionality, but because they want to get a job done, they want to achieve a benefit, they want to achieve an outcome.
And all these outcomes are all purely hypothesis, right? We don't know. We think we're going to get X whatever by delivering this. We don't know. Yeah, unless you've got your time.
Right. That's right. To a certain extent, they are. But then I'd like to draw your attention to, sort of in my model, the product roadmap is based on a validated product strategy. So. And that means we have talked to users and customers, we have observed them, we've looked into technical feasibility, we've looked into a business model for a revenue generating product. And so we're pretty confident that we've kind of nailed it, and we kind of selected the right needs, the right target group, the right standout feature. So we've also done some competitive analysis. We've selected realistic business goals. And now we kind of take those user customer goals, the needs and the business goals, and we break them down into more specific, ideally measurable, more short-term goals to provide more alignment and more direction for the development teams and the stakeholders. But of course, something might change, or some of the validation work that we did might have been wrong. And again, that's why it's so important to regularly then see what is happening with our product, see how we're doing in terms of implementing the roadmap, but also, what has changed in the marketplace, what has changed in terms of technologies, consumer behavior, competition, and so forth.
It's interesting. So really, you said it's almost like the roadmap. Would you ever do a roadmap without the strategy?
No, I wouldn't.
That's dangerous.
Yeah,
without validation. Yeah.
Dangerous to
me. For me, the roadmap really it's sort of the middle piece. It sort of glues together, or it connects a product backlog with a higher level strategy. So, and it should, for me, an effective, actionable product roadmap should always be based on a strategy, should always be based on a validated strategy. But again, that's just the way I like to do things, and I suggest people consider doing it. That's sort of the model that I've developed, and please think about what works best for you, and if you're in doubt, then maybe try it out and see how it works.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you. And listen, we're at our 8 o'clock. There's so many questions coming in that we could talk for a lot longer, I'm sure. But we've come to our 8 o'clock, and I think it's probably time to let Roman go and like John to watch the Liverpool game, and and everything else. So listen, let me just say thank you once again to Roman. What a great session. Thank you everyone for attending, and yeah, please stay safe out there, like given everything that's going on in the world, and enjoy your festive period. So goodbye. Thank you very much again.
Thanks, Roman. Thanks,
Cheers.
everyone.
Thanks, Roman.
Pleasure. Thank you.